Since I joined AI now, like what has become pretty apparent to me is that there is a clear fault line in the AI ethics and accountability space, one which has been predominantly shaped by Euro-American institutions and individuals. So I've heard the metaphor of first and second wave, but kind of essentially and crudely put, on the one hand, you will have the kind of AI ethics, more abstract conversations, the technical debiasing work, and on the other, a much more substantial, like both wider and deeper analysis of harms. And these are people and individuals who are kind of looking behind the hype of these systems to ask, who benefits from AI systems, who is harmed, and who gets to decide not just how these systems can be better, but whether they are built at all.
Biased data is data that is missing the characteristics of some individuals from the general population or the target population, and data that is also overrepresenting certain members of the population. To see the true benefits of AI, we need to start accurately representing all members of the population of interest that you're building technologies for and the data that you're using to deploy these algorithms.
One of the things that is happening in the AI ethics world is that people are moving the conversation from just calling it bias to calling it harm, algorithmic harm, because it could appear that when you're talking about bias, you're talking about a subject, you understand what bias is, but we really have to understand the second and third order consequences of algorithmic bias, and it ends up being harm to communities, harm to individuals, as Alton mentioned, especially when you're talking about predictive analytics around Bell algorithms and all sorts of things. And so for me, that's an important distinction that I'm starting to make in the engagements I'm a part of, is to start calling it what it is, which is harm to communities, so we can begin to address the real issues around it.
Social injustices and human biases have been replicated into AI algorithms, and this can make vulnerable groups who have a long history of being underrepresented and underserved, not only by technologies, but previously before, like even the internet age, particularly prone to bias. This is concerning in every single field. But when we talk about medicine and when we talk about public health, it literally can be the difference between life or death, as it affects access to healthcare resources and determines the level of treatment certain patients receive, causing misdiagnosis and ultimately deaths. Now, the medical field has several examples where racial, gender, or age disparities are affecting clinical decision-making. And we've got algorithms misdiagnosing heart attack in women. We've got algorithms also misdiagnosing heart attack in ethnic minorities. Other algorithms that just don't take into account gender and give the same risk scores for patients from the LGBTQ plus community to patients who are not members of that community.
AI has a huge power in education to level the playing field, to make education more equitable, but it also has just as a great risk of perpetuating inequality, and we see that in use cases all the time. Just last summer, there was a huge governance and failure in the UK when they decided to rely on algorithms to decide student grades. And very clearly, students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds were disadvantaged, unsurprisingly, and they lost their college seats, right? And that really has enormous implications for their future, especially in systems like that. It raises a couple of questions, especially regarding consent. Do students have the option to even opt in or opt out? There is really no governance of AI systems in education right now. Administrators are just kind of implementing it as they see fit, without really any transparency or explanation to either their students or even the parents. In the last few years in Lockport, New York, they were using AI to protect students, to identify potential weapons, and using facial recognition in cameras around the perimeter to ward off pedophiles. But what ended up happening is the AI system was mistaking Black and minority students as criminals, and then also mistaking broomsticks as guns.
The tools that are fundamentally built to reduce harm can often reinforce it. And one good example of this is pretrial risk assessment tools. So algorithms judges use to determine a defendant's risk of reoffense before a sentencing hearing. In many states, this was heralded as a solution to cash bail, which many people know has lots of issues and often reinforces like income inequality, wealth inequality, but they don't understand the ways in which these algorithms can also reinforce all sorts of different things. So pretrial risk assessments were proposed as this technological solution, but those who were deemed most risky would be put in prison until their hearing, and everyone else would be allowed to await their trial. But in the first iteration, many of these tools included race as predictive variables. Many of them included zip codes. Many of them included things like, do you own a cell phone, or do you pay rent? In short, it means that tweaking code doesn't rid systems of bias or power. Technological tools will not be able to solve social problems on their own, and we really should stop asking them to do so and instead build tools from the ground up that are supposed to help the world in the ways that we want them to.
You mentioned something that was so important, not just having someone who has a different perspective on the team to bring up a potential issue, but actually listening when they do. There are organizations that have these people on these teams, and then these people are incredibly disappointed and feel, not heard when they kind of push forward with the project anyway. Or organizations will go and work with contractors or consultants to do this exact kind of work. And then they get feedback, especially when it comes to algorithmic problems of, okay, maybe you abandon this project, maybe you go down a different route, and they ignore it and do the same thing anyway. So until we see, I think, on the other side of things, regulation that actually is meaningful, that requires these companies to pay fines that are large enough to actually hurt them as an organization, we're not going to see, unfortunately, Black voices really get listened to. I think that's the other half of the coin, is that when we are there, if we're not protected and listened to, we're still not able to have this impact, and they can just kind of check off the diversity aspect when they bring on someone new, but not really work to both retain that person or have them give legitimate input or have them in leadership roles.
That question is whether these systems should be built at all, or say whether they are used, is essentially a political accountability question. And this strikes me a lot as I'm working more with my colleagues on kind of US legislation and policy, whether it's impact assessments or the federal algorithmic accountability bill, or even the state and city bills on facial recognition. A lot of the policy innovation is really around what are avenues for intervention at the earliest possible stage? What does meaningful participation or consultation look like? Essentially questions that are not tech policy questions, but are broader political accountability questions at city, state, and federal level.
AI bias is a big problem that people always point to. And by people, I mean policymakers or organizations that are doing policy work. The logical step after that is always to say, we need more data, right? And so that's kind of like a self-serving vicious circle that I think is really important to push back against. I think having that distinction of, yes, bias exists, and knowing how bias exists and why bias exists is really important. A de-biased data set doesn't make sense to me, because bias is inherent to the human experience, the societal experience.